Indian music sounds much sweeter. Whatever the Indians sing and whatever music they play, they don't do it for of a joke. It's serious thing for whoever understand it. It brings such serious feelings to you. Calypso, they only sing. You might hear calypso. You will just feel happy to jump up. But if you hear a real technical piece of Indian music, you might sit down stiff and still, and you might be contrasting so much that you mightn't know when it start or when it finish. For these Trinidadians, Indianized pieces borrowed from 20th century urban indie music, indie culture, are therefore heard as more authentic than the local westernized repertory, a reflection of their New World heritage. Authenticity in this context is a quality not of the music as such, how it is actually made, but of the story it's heard to tell, the narrative of musical interaction in which the listeners place themselves. Conclusion. Music constructs our sense of identity through the direct experiences it offers of the body, time, and sociability. Experiences which enable us to place ourselves in imaginative cultural narratives, such a fusion of imaginative fantasy and bodily practice marks also the integration of aesthetics and ethics. John Miller Chernoff has thus eloquently demonstrated how among African musicians and aesthetic judgment, this sounds good, is necessarily also an ethical judgment. This is good. The issue is balance. The quality of rhythmic relationships describes a quality of social life. In this sense, style is another word for the perception of relationships. Without balance and coolness, the African musicians loses aesthetic command, and their music abdicates its social authority, becoming hot, intense, limited, pretentious, overly personal, boring, irrelevant, and ultimately alienating. And as the dance gives visible form to the music, as so too does the dance give full and visible articulation to the ethical qualities which work through the music, balance in the disciplined expression of power in relationship. Identity is thus necessarily a matter of ritual. It describes one's place in a dramatized pattern of relationships. One can never really express oneself autonomously. Self-identity is cultural identity. Claims to individual difference depend on the audience appreciation, on shared performing and narrative rules. As Appia puts it, the problem of who I really am is raised by facts of what I appear to be. And though it is essential to the mythology of authenticity that this fact should be obscured by prophets, what I appear to be is fundamentally how I appear to others, and only derivatively how I appear to myself. In her study of music making in the very wide Milton Keynes, the Haydn musicians Ruth Finnegan persuasively argues that these days People's voluntarily leisure activities are more likely to provide their pathways through life than their paid employment. It was in their musical activities that her city dwellers found their most convincing narratives. It was in their aesthetic judgments that they expressed their most deep-seated ethical views. This is, perhaps, ironically, to come back to music via a spatial metaphor. But what makes music special, what makes it special for identity, is that it defines a space without boundaries, a game without frontiers. Music is thus the cultural form best able both to cross borders, sounds, carry across fences and walls and oceans, across classes, races and nations, and to define places in clubs, scenes and raves, listening on headphones, radio and in the concert hall. We are only where the music takes us. Identity, Genealogy, History, Nicholas Rose. To breed an animal with the right to make promises, how much all this presupposes. A man who wishes to dispose of his future in this manner must first have learned to separate necessary from accidental acts, to distinguish, to think causally, to see distant things as though they were near at hand, to distinguish means from ends. In short, he must have become not only calculating, but himself calculable, regular even to his own perception, if he is to stand pledged for his own future. Friedrich Nietzsche, The Genealogy of Morals, second essay, The Origins and Genesis of Human Responsibility. How should we do the history of the person? What might be the relationship between such an historical endeavor and current concerns in social and political theory, with such issues as identity, self, body, desire? More significantly, perhaps, what light might historical investigations cast upon current ethical preoccupations with human beings as subjects of autonomy and freedom, or alternatively, as bound to a national ethic, cultural or territorial identity, and the political programs, strategies and techniques to which they are linked? I would like to suggest a particular approach to this issue, an approach which I term the genealogy of subjectification. The phrasing is awkward, but I think important. Its importance lies in part in indicating what such an undertaking is not. On the one hand, it is not an attempt to write the history of changing ideas of the person as they have figured within philosophy, literature, culture, etc. Historians, philosophers, and anthropologists have long engaged in the writing of such narratives, and no doubt they are significant and instructive. A.G. Taylor, 1989, and C.F. the very different approach they have advocated in Tully, 1993. But it is unwise to assume that one can derive from an account of notions of the human being in cosmology, philosophy, aesthetics, or literature evidence about the organization of the mundane everyday practices pre- and presuppositions that shape the conduct of human beings in particular sites and practices. Dion 1994. A genealogy of subjectification is therefore not a history of ideas. Its domain of investigation is that of practices and techniques of thought as it seeks to make itself technical. Equally, my approach needs to be distinguished from attempts to write the history of the person or self as a psychological entity, to see how different ages produce humans with different psychological characteristics, different emotions, beliefs, pathologies. Such a project for a history of the self is certainly imaginable, and something like this aspiration shapes a number of recent studies, some of which I discuss below. But such analysis presupposes a way of thinking that is itself an outcome of history, one that emerges only if the 19th century, for it is only at this historical moment and in a limited and localized geographical space, that a way of thinking emerges in which human being is understood in terms of persons each equipped with an inner domain, a psychology which is structured by the interaction of biographical experience with certain laws or processes characteristic of human psychology. A genealogy of subjectification takes his individualized, interiorized, totalized, and psychologized understanding of what it is to be human as delineating the site of a historical problem, not providing the grounds for a historical narrative. Such a genealogy works toward an account of the ways in which this modern regime of the self emerges, not as the outcome of any gradual process of enlightenment in which humans, aided by the endeavors of science, come at last to reorganize their true nature, but out of a number of contingent and altogether less refined and dignified practices and processes. To write such a genealogy is to seek to unpick the ways in which the self, that functions as a regulatory ideal in so many aspects of our contemporary forms of life, not merely in our passional relations with one another, but in our projects of life planning, our ways of managing industrial and other organizations, our systems of consumption. Many of our genres of literature and aesthetic production is a kind of a real plan of projection, put together somewhat contingently and haphazardly at the intersection of a range of these distinct histories of forms and thought, techniques of regulation, problems of organization, and so forth. Dimensions of our relation to ourselves. A genealogy of subjectification is a genealogy of what one might term, following Michel Foucault, our relation to ourselves. Its field of investigation comprises the kinds of attention that humans have directed toward themselves and others in different places, spaces, and times. To put this rather more grandly, one might say that this was a genealogy of being's relation to itself and the technical forms that this has assumed. The human being, that is to say, is that kind of creature whose ontology is historical. And the history of human being, therefore, requires an investigation of the intellectual and practical techniques that have comprised the instruments through which being has historically constituted itself. It is a matter of analyzing the problematizations through which being offers itself to be necessarily thought, and the practices on the basis of which these problematizations are formed. Foucault, 1986. Jambet, 1992. The focus of such a genealogy, therefore, is not the historical construction of the self, but the history of the relations which human beings have established with themselves. These relations are constructed and historical, but they are not to be understood by locating them in some amorphous domain of culture. On the contrary, they are addressed from the perspective of government. Foucault, 1991. Our relation with ourselves, that is to say, has assumed the form it has because it has been the object of a whole variety of more or less rationalized schemes, which have sought to shape our ways of understanding and enacting our existence as human beings in the name of certain objectives, manliness, femininity, honor, modesty, property, civility, discipline, distinction, efficiency, harmony, fulfillment, virtue, pleasure. The list is as diverse and heterogeneous as it is interminable. One of the reasons for stressing this point is to distinguish my approach from a number of recent analyses that have explicitly or implicitly viewed changing forms of subjectivity or identity as a consequences of wider social changing forms of subjectivity or identity as consequences of wider social and cultural transformations. Modernity, late modernity, the risk society, Bauman, 1992, Beck, 1992, 1991, 1992, Giddens, 1991, Lashens Friedman, 1992. Of course, this work continues a long tradition of narratives stretching back at the least to Jacob Burckhardt, that have written histories of the rise of individual as a consequence of a general social transformation from traditional to modernity, feudalism to capitalism, Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft, mechanical to organic solidarity, and so forth. Burckhardt, 1990. These kinds of analysis regard changes in the ways in which human beings understand and act upon themselves as the outcome of more fundamental historical events located elsewhere. In production regimes, in technological change, in alterations in demography or family forms, in culture. No doubt, events in each of these areas have significance in relation to the problem of subjectification. But however significant they may be, it is important to insist that such changes do not transform ways of being human by virtue or some experience that they produce. Changing relations of subjectification, I want to argue, cannot be established by derivation or interpretation of other cultural or social forms. To explicitly or implicitly assume that they can is to presume the continuity of human beings as the subjects of history, essentially equipped with the capacity for endowing meaning. Dean 1994. But the ways in which humans give meaning to experience have their own history, devices of meaning production, grids of visualization, vocabularies, norms, and systems of judgment produce experience. They are not themselves produced by experience. Joyce 1994. These intellectual techniques do not come ready-made. They have to be invented, refined, and stabilized. They have to be disseminated and implanted in very ways in different practices, schools, families, streets, workplaces, courtrooms. If we use the term subjectification to designate all those heterogeneous processes and practices by means of which human beings come to relate to themselves and others as subjects of certain type, then subjectification has its own history. And the history of subjectification is more practical, more technical, and less unified than sociological accounts allow.